Simpson Comanche Jack Stillwell did not reach the spotlight of Buffalo Bill Cody or Wild Bill Hickok, but his name carried weight for one reason. In 1868, at the Battle of Beecher Island, he took on a decisive role. From then on, his path reveals risky choices, unlikely alliances, and a knack for surviving on the frontier. In New York, at the 1930 World's Fair, a record highlights the scene that captured attention. A Hopi woman, in ritual attire and with traditional side rolls in her hair, presents her twin babies. In the space dedicated to indigenous peoples, motherhood and dress emerge as a window into Hopi daily life and identity. On the U.S. frontiers of the 19th century, photography opens a window into overlooked backstage scenes. Women from brothels recorded in their rooms, facing the camera. The images, sometimes formal, sometimes improvised, suggest work, intimacy, and control of their own portrait, challenging the gaze of the observer. Bill Dulan, a feared figure in the Oklahoma Territory, began his life of crime alongside the Dalton Gang. His name spread across the country when he escaped unscathed from the Coffeyville shootout. Years later, an 1896 cabinet card made by Doherty and Guthrie records the fate that caught up with him and opens the door to the next chapter. In the late 19th century, at the Umatilla Reservation, Oregon, Rattlesnake Pete gained fame. Among Cayuse, Umatilla, and Walla Walla, life revolved around bargains and pressures, federal laws, missionaries, markets. Rituals endured even when the agency imposed schools and fences, shrinking the land and reshaping daily life. In Death Valley in the 1870s, Borax began to move again. To cross the dryness of the Great Basin came the wagons pulled by 20 mules, lines that marched firmly, carrying the ore from the mines to the depots. The harshness of the journey shaped a method that combined animal strength, engineering, and coordination to overcome the desert. At 18 years old, John Wesley Harden was already leaving his mark on the Old West. The photo dates from 1871. By the time he died in 1895, he had claimed between 27 and 42 lives, a tally that sustained his fame among gunfighters. His trajectory cuts across border towns, railroads, and saloons, and still today sparks curiosity about the price of violence and the fear his name inspired. In 1885, Ben Whittick photographed Sergeant Jim, a White Mountain Apache scout. The record highlights the role of scouts in the Army's campaigns in the Southwest. They guided and negotiated routes between troops and villages. Subscribe to our channel and send the video to someone who loves the Old West. Your support motivates us to keep making videos. On the left of the photo, Black Elk appears as both witness and protagonist of two milestones. In 1876, he took part in Little Bighorn, when U.S. forces faced several Great Plains tribes, among them the Lakota Sioux, at a decisive point of indigenous resistance. His life links the scene to the broad thread of American history. An albumin photograph captures a turning point in Old West law. Pinkerton agents set out in pursuit of the feared Wild Bunch around 1900. On the left stands Charlie Seringo. Before wearing the badge, he knew dust and cattle as a cowboy in Texas and the New Mexico Territory, and that shaped his hunt. Around 1900 in New Mexico, native women from various peoples sustained livelihoods in markets by selling pots. From clay in their hands to the shine of polishing, they painted and fired in open flames, inherited techniques. The pieces served the kitchen and trade also as currency, weaving local networks and ties with settlers. Son of Cynthia Ann Parker, captured in childhood and taken in by the Comanches, Quana Parker grew up between frontiers and assumed leadership. When buffalo hunters invaded the plains, he rose in resistance, wove alliances and strategies to defend land and culture, opening the passage between an end and a beginning. This cabinet card, an undated photograph, was produced by the Pawnee Gallery in the town of Pawnee. It belongs to a moment of ambiguous perceptions about the Oklahoma Territory, caught between colonization expectations and economic uncertainties. In 1896, the Guthrie Daily Leader recorded the prevailing sentiment, "No good exists or can come from Oklahoma." In the 1930s in New Mexico, a Navajo equestrian game took center stage in the open landscape. Riders advanced and retreated in agile contests. The horse was symbolic currency and sustenance. Around them, families gathered, renewed alliances, and transmitted handling techniques, marking the rhythm of the festive calendar. In an old portrait, two sex workers pose in a brothel room in Miles, Montana. A judge of the time said there were 1,000 residents and little order. The photo condenses the contrast. A glossy setting before faltering laws, luxury and precariousness side by side, revealing the city between showcase and ruin in motion. Roy Bean, seen in this cabinet card around 1895, became a symbol of the Old West. Self-proclaimed law west of the Pecos, he served as Justice of the Peace in Langtry, Texas, holding court in his own saloon. His rulings, shaped by pragmatism and local interests, alternated between fines and swift acquittals, generating lasting controversy. In the early years of the 20th century, Geronimo, Chiricahua Apache leader, lived as a prisoner of war at Fort Sill, Oklahoma, since the 1886 surrender. Even so, his path in the campaigns against U.S. and Mexican forces kept shaping his image, making him a symbol of indigenous resistance and battlefield command. In the photo, a cowboy from Caldwell, Kansas, shows that the outfit comes from the trade. Hat, boots, and belt serve before they decorate. They face sun, dust, and saddle. Depending on climate and terrain, he chooses chaps over his pants, protecting his legs and against the rain. Each piece has a function and tells the routine of the open range. Satanta, Kiowa chief, appears in a photo dated August 18, 1868. He wears a peace medal, likely received at the signing of the Medicine Lodge Treaty in 1867. The image records Native presence in federal negotiations and highlights the tensions and agreements that marked U.S. policy during expansion into the Great Plains. In 1925 in Santa Fe, New Mexico, The Feast, a musical gathering, took place which, according to local records, featured a singer of Cherokee origin. Her program combined traditional songs and then recent works. The event brought indigenous communities and the urban public together, establishing the feast as an annual cultural rite. Pointed out as his last image, this photograph of George Armstrong Custer reveals a military man who made the camera an ally. Restless about his own figure, he posed more than 150 times. 2 months after this portrait came the decisive episode, the Battle of Little Bighorn in 1876, where his command would collapse. Frank Randall, photographer of the Old West, is recognized for capturing some of the earliest images of Geronimo, the Chiricahua Apache leader. In 1884, at the San Carlos Reservation in what was then the Arizona Territory, he produced a series of portraits that show the period of confinement and federal surveillance, a rare visual record of Geronimo's leadership. In 1900, at the start of the century, photographer Carl Wertens, known for portraying North American indigenous peoples, recorded the daughter of Chief Alkisi, White River Apache leader in Arizona. In the image, clothing, posture, and adornments confirm the family's lineage and place in the village's social order at that time. With the decline of the daguerreotype, the Ambrotype took the stage. Image on glass, lower cost, peak in the 1850s. In this portrait, an unnamed man faces the camera. The steady gaze and restrained posture turn the instant into a memory of the West in transition, a sign of a frontier being redrawn in the young nation. In March 1886, photographer C.S. Fly of Tombstone, Arizona Territory, accompanied General George Crook on an incursion across the border into Sonora to negotiate with Chiricahua leaders. On site, Fly recorded a series of images. Among them, a scene of Chiricahua Apache men, women, and children gathered during the talks. In 1890 in Montana, the record of Eddie Gray, son of White Elk and a voice among the Northern Cheyenne, emerges as a marker of continuity. His name connects lineages and rituals. At the same time, the Dawes Act and federal assimilation compressed lands and customs, while Western expansion pushed the frontier over their territories. In Greenwood, Kansas, noon halts the march. The emigrants gather around the wagon, share food, and catch their breath. Cutlery clinks lightly. Voices exchange messages. The path regains rhythm. When hunger eases, the vehicle advances, and each step signs promises of work and land, a tomorrow under construction. George Armstrong Custer, officer of the U.S. 7th Cavalry and a controversial figure of the West, appears in this cabinet card produced by William Howell in New York in April 1876. The image is significant for preceding by 2 months the death of Custer and his men at the Battle of Little Bighorn amid the campaigns against the Plains peoples. In 1899, F.A. Reinhardt photographed Good Eagle, Wanbli Waste in Lakodiapi, a member of the Oglala Lakota. The portrait is part of an effort to record the Plains peoples at the end of the 19th century, when the U.S. government tightened control in the West and highlights the place of his sub-tribe among the 7 of the Lakota. In the early years of the 20th century, Joella Irwin crossed the rodeo fence and opened space for cowgirls. In varied circuits, she competed in different events and proved skill, courage, and rhythm. Her journey united tradition and change, attracted audiences, and brought new female athletes to the center of the arena. McCubbin, collector of historical photographs with verified provenance, encounters a singular case, an image of uncertain authorship. There is no documentary proof linking it to buckskin Frank Leslie. Still, he sustains the attribution by comparing features, scars, beard, and posture with an authenticated portrait of Leslie from the same era. Joseph White Bull, Dakota warrior and nephew of Sitting Bull, was born around 1849. In 1876, at the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana, he claimed to have brought down Colonel George Custer, a version echoed in Sioux tradition. Later, he lived on reservations. He died in 1947 at the age of 98, holding memories of a turbulent century. In 1884, a cabinet card, a popular photographic format, records a scene at the San Carlos Reservation in Arizona. The portrait, considered the first known image of Geronimo, presents the Apache leader who, from historical role to mass culture, became a lasting symbol widely recognized across generations. The first original historical photograph acquired by McCubbin shows Pat Garrett, then Sheriff of Lincoln County in the New Mexico Territory. Known for capturing and killing Billy the Kid, he shot him on July 14, 1881 at Fort Sumner, an act that ended the post-Lincoln War pursuit and fixed his place in Western history. Chief Two Sticks, also called Kan-Nopa Uha, was a Lakota leader on the Great Plains. He was part of the Ochethi-Sakowing, the Sioux Confederation of Collective Leadership, participating in diplomatic and military decisions. He earned the name Nom Kappa, knocks down two, when facing the UTEs and bringing down 2 horses with a single war club blow. Jesse James became the most famous face of the James Younger Gang. Leading robberies, he crossed the West and became an emblem of crime. With each strike, his fame grew, fueled by newspapers and conversations that painted him as rebel or villain. The journey ended abruptly. Betrayed at home, killed in 1882, the legend swallowed the man. Lola Montes, Irish-born and a traveling performer of the 19th century, gained fame with the tarantula dance. In 1853, upon arriving in California during the gold rush, she performed it in theaters and mining camps. The choreography simulated expelling a spider from her skirts, a gesture that defied moral norms and drew large crowds with castanets. Last Horse, Oglala Lakota leader, roamed the plains of the western United States at the end of the 19th century. After years of clashes with colonial expansion, he surrendered his weapons in 1899, among the last. Taken to a reservation, he lived under confinement and died in 1909. His trajectory marked the decline of the Plains Wars. Symbol of U.S. expansion, Kit Carson crossed trails that defined the West. He left the fur trade, became an explorer, and in the mountains earned fame for endurance. Later, he guided John Pathfinder Fremont on decisive expeditions, fixing his name in an era when maps were born step by step and opened future paths. At 20 years old, John Henry Holliday graduated from the Pennsylvania College of Dental Surgery and began practicing dentistry. The portrait records his adult phase before his turn westward. Years later, already called Doc, he gained notoriety for his role in the shootout near the OK Corral in Tombstone. The change came in search of a drier climate. A photograph shows a Cherokee woman holding a baby in her arms, likely her son. The record takes place in Oklahoma, the destination of many peoples removed after the 19th century. Produced in the 1920s, the image cuts across federal assimilation policies and exposes changes in ways of life and community ties over time. The photograph, around 1880, shows sitters still unconfirmed. Researchers point out that the standing man may be John Kinney, who in 1875 took command of a gang in southern New Mexico. By occupying that role, he gained notoriety and marked the criminal scene. For that reason, the image still raises questions. Called the New Mexico Thieves, the portrayed men appear in a cabinet card, a studio photograph dated around 1880. Academic debate surrounds the identity of the standing man, possibly John Kinney, gang leader dedicated to horse and cattle theft in the New Mexico Territory, active in the 1870s and 1880s. This photograph presents a cayuse remembered by several names: Dr. Whirlwind, Charlie Saplish, and Pi Shamkane. A member of the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla, he lived on the Umatilla Reservation in Oregon, USA. The record is by Lee Morehouse in the early 20th century, when he was documenting indigenous practices and leaders. In 1899, Pearl Hart robbed a stagecoach and entered the history of the West. The news crossed states, brought her name to headlines, and in a short time to Cosmopolitan magazine. There, her figure took on public outline and was fixed as a farewell sign of an era when old trails gave way to a new country. The Texas Rangers, considered the first statewide law enforcement force in the U.S., emerged in the Republic of Texas, still independent, to patrol settlements and border routes. After annexation, their role expanded. In 1874, the government created the Frontier Battalion, uniting 6 ranger companies under centralized command. In the 1891 photo, we see Mrs. Thunderbear, a Lakota and interpreter among the Sioux in the northern United States. The record comes after the Indian Wars, when federal confinement policies pushed communities onto reservations. In this context, she mediated between tribal leaders and government agents, reshaping political and cultural practices. At 15 years old, Rose Dunn, the Rose of Cimarron, crossed the border from news into legend. In 1895, in Ingalls, Oklahoma Territory, she is said to have helped her fugitive boyfriend in a shootout between agents and outlaws. Versions differ, but it was there that her name left anonymity and began to fuel the myth of the Old West. James Butler Wild Bill Hickok, often pointed to as the first gunfighter of the West, gained fame on July 21, 1865 in Springfield, Missouri, when he killed Dave Tutt in a duel sparked by a debt and a taken watch. The episode set the model of the face-to-face showdown in later imagination and in Hollywood. In the 1880s, a Blackfoot woman in a fur coat and felt hat holds in her arms a child also protected by furs. Both look at the camera. The child's curiosity contrasts with the mother's serenity. Ross Alexander recorded the scene amid changes and cultural assimilation policies in the Plains Territory. From the front to the corral, Texas John Slaughter traveled a path that illuminates the Old West. In the Civil War, he served as a Texas Ranger. With peace, he followed cattle and established his last ranch near Douglas, Arizona. A photo from around 1885 crystallizes the turning point and extends his memory to those arriving now. In 1887, photographer John Grable captured this scene. A cowboy identified in the copyright caption as Fred Pierce, a noted cowboy of Wyoming. The mention suggests local reputation, but his identity remains uncertain. The 1880 censuses of the territory contain no unequivocal records of Fred Pierce in the available documentation. In 1900, in Lapwai, Idaho, Netti Morris, a young Nez Perce, poses for the camera. She wears a long dress with embroidery, fringes, and a beaded necklace. 2 braids rest on her shoulders. Her gaze is calm. Her story is tied to a people of the Pacific Northwest, heirs of the plateau culture, then under pressure from assimilation. Olive Oatman turned her own life into proof of endurance. Captured by the Mojave, she lived with the community and, in that coexistence, received on her chin a tattoo in blue cactus ink. It was not ornament. It was a rite that, according to tradition, ensured a serene passage to the afterlife. Thus, the mark became a reminder of crossed destinies. While serving a warrant against Andy Cooper, a horse thief in Holbrook in what was then the Arizona Territory, Apache County Sheriff Commodore Perry Owens faced armed resistance. The clash, brief and witnessed by townspeople on the spot, ended with 3 dead. Cooper himself and brothers Samuel and John Blevins all shot by Owens. In 1910, Chief Anatlas Anyalahash, Tlingit leader on the Pacific Northwest coast, was portrayed in a historic photograph with a Chilkat blanket. Woven with mountain goat wool and yellow cedar bark, the piece displays geometric forms and sacred beings. In rituals and dances, it signaled Tlingit prestige and authority. The Texas Rangers emerged improvised in 1823, when Stephen Austin summoned men to protect settlers. In 1835, they gained official structure. Throughout Texan history, they patrolled borders, hunted fugitives, and carried out missions that upheld order in a growing territory and consolidated their fame. Bat Masterson, former scout for the U.S. Army, gained notoriety as an efficient sheriff in frontier towns. He considered Wyatt Earp a respected peer and a reference point of the West. In statements to President Theodore Roosevelt, he maintained that only Earp could accurately recount the events of that period. For him, Earp was the memory. Duncan Macdonald, Flathead leader and historian, poses with his wife Mary Agnes at their home in Ravalli, Montana, around 1901. The portrait by N.A. Forsyth is part of a project to document local indigenous peoples. Son of a Scottish trader and a Flathead woman, Macdonald defended rights and preserved the memory of his people. A forgotten photo reappears. A woman drives cattle through a west, still without a name. She appears by chance, discovered by Mark Lee Gardner in a Missouri store, and opens a passage into a past of dust, work, and command. Who was she? Where did she live? What journey brought her there? The image asks for answers and returns questions. Dated around 1850, this portrait records a man of unknown identity. The daguerreotype, a common medium in the early years of photography, shows a frontiersman of mixed ancestry, likely Metis. Clues in the clothing and framing suggest ties to trade routes and contacts between indigenous and European peoples. In 1880, 2 Apache women pose in front of a wickiup, a shelter of curved branches covered with leaves or hides, erected in the arid Arizona landscape near a spring. The image by Noah H. Rose records indigenous life, labor, and movement under U.S. expansion and the changing control of federal authorities. In the far reaches of the Old West, Tibio Vasquez etched his name into collective memory. The 1865 photo crystallizes the face that became an emblem of transgression. For nearly 20 years, he crossed villages and roads in crimes, shaping the myth of Hispanic outlaws and fueling, to this day, the dispute over his reputation. A daguerreotype from 1850, among the earliest images of a fur trapper, portrays James P. Beckworth. The photograph was later included in his autobiography, published in 1856. Beckworth was born in 1798 in Virginia, the son of an enslaved mother and an overseer of Irish origin. Years later, he would work in the West and among the Crow as a guide and trader. On the Western Plains in the late 19th century, a white man and a Cheyenne Indian exchange a handshake. The gesture suggests the post-Civil War period. At the time, Cheyenne and Arapaho, allies of the Sioux, lived and resisted the military advance over their lands, which exterminated the buffalo. The contact is fragile, marked by historical tension. In the Old West, the routine of cowboys went beyond cattle drives. Between one drive and another, many sought the studio to immortalize themselves. Worn hat, used boots, firm belt. The portrait became a keepsake and a certificate of trade. putting on paper the life they rode and wanted to preserve as a milestone for themselves and those who remained. Although buffalo hunting was common in the Old West, visual documentation of hunters is scarce. An exception is this cabinet card dated 1880, possibly made in a traveling studio. The scene shows a hunter with a Sharps rifle, a usual weapon associated with large-scale slaughter on the Great Plains for the hide and bone market. In 1916, H.C. Tibbets photographed a young Apache woman in the arid southwest of the United States. On her head, she balances a woven straw olla basket made to store water collected from temporary rivers or wells. The image reveals routines of supply and the female role in the villages during a period of intense ethnography. Bill Dulan, outlaw in Oklahoma Territory, became a target when the reward increased. The fame of the robberies mobilized groups and trackers who tightened the noose. In August 1896, the hunt ended. In confrontation, he fell under gunfire. At the front, Heck Thomas, deputy marshal, led the action that ended his trajectory. In 1876, the attempted robbery of the Northfield, Minnesota, bank by the James Younger Gang, became a landmark crime of the West. The armed reaction of townspeople foiled the attempt, resulting in deaths and captures during the ensuing escape. After the episode, cartes de visite, then popular, were produced, recording the arrested and at times the dead. In 1873, surveyors traveling through the American West relied on a travois, an A-frame drag, to transport instruments and provisions. The scene was recorded by William Henry Jackson, famous for his images of Yellowstone and for joining government geological and geographic expeditions. During the funeral of Tom McClory, Frank McClory, and Billy Clanton, a sign was raised, "Murdered in the streets of Tombstone." It was not protest, it was a reminder of a shock. In 1881, behind the OK Corral, a brief duel silenced 3 men and launched a story that crossed generations, shaping the myth of the West, which still echoes today. Samantha Fallon worked as a businesswoman in Tombstone, Arizona Territory, managing the San Jose House Hotel and a millinery. Her portrait was taken by C.S. Fly in a cabinet card around 1879. Local sources indicate personal ties with central figures of the town where business, sociability, and power intersected. In studio, As Sao Ta Ka, Whitehorse of the Pawnee Nation, stares into the camera. He was a guide and ally of the U.S. Army in the Plains campaigns. The portrait is from 1870, about 2 years after joining the Hayden expedition to Yellowstone. The author, William Henry Jackson, a Civil War veteran, pioneered photography of the West. Kate Rockwell, stage performer, made her mark on Alaskan miners in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In crowded saloons, she alternated songs and steps that led laughter to attentive silence. The climax came with the red chiffon, her trademark. Thus, she tamed rough nights and left a vivid memory on that frontier. In March 1886, during the negotiations between General George Crook and Geronimo at Canon de los Embudos in northwestern Mexico, C.S. Fly recorded key scenes of the U.S. Apache conflict. In one of them, an Apache appears in a 3-piece suit, evidence of intercultural contact and the tension with his people's traditional dress. Pebo, of the Comanche Nation, a Uto Aztecan-speaking people who dominated the southern plains in the 18th and 19th centuries, lived in Oklahoma, then incorporated as Indian Territory after federal removal policies. There, encounters with settlers and the U.S. Army marked his time. He was born in 1911. No record exists of his death. In the 1865 photo, Wild Bill Hickok appears without stage scenery or costume. Far from the theatrical outfits of other poses, he wears what he used in everyday life. The detail reveals his preference in presenting himself in the Old West. Looking at the image, a faithful portrait emerges of the style and clothing choices of the time without studio tricks. The death notice of John Wesley Harden, the well-known Texan outlaw, was blunt. John Wesley Harden, the famous desperado of Texas, is no more. Issued after the August 1895 episode, it recorded his death at the hands of lawman John Selman in the Acme Saloon in El Paso, Texas, bringing to an end a life of confrontations and escapes. In 1879, Modisi, a young Hopi from Walpi, Arizona, was portrayed by John Hillers, photographer of federal expeditions. In the photo, she sits with her hands in her lap, wearing the attire of her people. In the background, a fabric with geometric patterns. The portrait is part of a series that documented Hopi daily life and architecture in the late 19th century. In 1876, at the height of the cattle drives, Bat Masterson and Wyatt Earp posed in Dodge City. The image is not just a record, it consolidates the alliance of two lawmen willing to impose order in a frontier town. By fixing this meeting, the portrait connects the cattle trails to the birth of an authority that would shape the history of the United States. The last known image of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Robert Leroy Parker and Harry Longabaugh, dates to around 1907. Taken in the Bolivian Andes when they lived in exile after escapes through the U.S. and Argentina, the photo highlights the end of their career and the change of setting, from the plains of the West to Andean mining towns. In 1905, Edward S. Curtis photographed Geronimo, Apache leader and symbol of resistance to United States expansion. He appears serious, wearing a hat and scarf with a rifle in his hands. The image is part of the North American Indian, vast documentation with more than 40,000 photographs dedicated to Native American peoples. Portrait of John Simpson Chisholm, known as the Cattle King, published in 1907 in The Story of the Outlaw by Emerson Ho. Active in the cattle trade since 1854, Chisholm formed a partnership in 1866 with Charles Goodnight and Oliver Loving. Along the western routes, they drove large herds to the New Mexico Territory, consolidating supply networks. Apache Kid, a historical figure surrounded by controversy, acted among the Apaches in the southwestern United States, in the Arizona Territory. He began as a respected Army scout, mediating contacts and tracking groups. After clashes with authorities, deaths in retaliations, and judicial misunderstandings, he came to be classified as an outlaw.